Hello, can I ask everyone to make their way to their seats, please? This is my final task as your compere today. There's a cup of coffee there, and as soon as this cup of coffee is in my hand, I'm just going to enjoy this session. And I'm never putting on a mic again. It's made me feel like I'm a cyborg the last couple of days. So we're going to open our two roundtable panels. Thank you so much for those of you that have stayed on either in the room or on the live stream. And I'm going to hand straight over to our chair and moderator, Jens Lundsgaard, Deputy Director of the Science, Technology and Innovation Directorate at the OECD. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And welcome everyone to this post-conference special session dedicated to pro-productivity institutions. They may be called different things, productivity commissions, productivity boards. Here we'll use those terms interchangeably. And over the next two rounds, we will be exploring what are the rationales for establishing such commissions, how does that shape their remit, and what's the experience made by newly established boards and longer-lasting, more established, you could say, commissions. The first roundtable will focus on the recently established commissions, and the second roundtable will take those that have been around for a little longer. What's the context? Well, it's been well explored these days. We are in a period of stagnant productivity growth, and productivity commissions can play a key role in supporting evidence-based policymaking. Now, they are each unique, having their context-specific challenges that they've been set up to handle, with unique mandates and institutional settings. And that can shape how they work, and that's a great source of international learning. For countries that might think of set up productivity boards, the experience of the newly established bodies can be a reflection on how it can be done nowadays. And definitely those commissions that have been around for a longer time will offer us a lot of food for thought about what are the programs that have worked, what are the results that have been achieved, and which institutional factors have worked well over the longer term. So let's start with the first round. And here we are dealing with the recently established productivity commissions. And to help us with that, I am very pleased to introduce and welcome Carlo Altomonte, who acts as the expert counselor coordinating the Italian National Productivity Board. Carlo, you are also Professor of Economics at the European Integration at Bocconi, and you are the Associate Dean for Stakeholder Engagement at SDA Bocconi School of Management.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you.
Next, we have Alessandro Turini. You are Head of Unit for Structural Policies at the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission. And in that role, you are working very closely with productivity boards across a number of countries. We're also very pleased to be joined by a gentleman from our host country, the Right Honourable Greg Clark, Executive Chair of the University of Warwick's Innovation District, and a member of the Government's Industrial Strategy Advisory Council, ISAC. Greg previously served as Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and also as Minister for Universities and Science. And last but not least, we have Juan Francisco Gimero, Advisor at the Bank of Spain, President of the Spanish National Productivity Board, and Associate Professor at the University of Alcalá. Well, I have two questions for each of you, and the first question is actually the same, going to all of you. Basically, let's start by understanding the rationale for why productivity boards have been set up in different cases, and how that shapes the work. We will start by our host, Greg.
Thank you, Jens. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. The reason for setting up the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council, as it's called, which was set up towards the end of last year, I think arises from two needs or two desires, stability and independence. Stability, and I should perhaps give a bit of context here, in those previous ministerial positions, one of the things I did was to develop an industrial strategy and indeed to have an industrial strategy council. But when I left office, it was abolished. And that tells you something. Ministers come and go, governments come and go, but having industrial strategies that come and go with that same frequency is not a good thing. Industrial strategy, any strategy, should be there for the long term. A short-term strategy is a contradiction in terms. So in democratic settings, how you can give a bit more permanence and stability to an industrial strategy, given the churn of ministers and sometimes governments and administrations, has been a bit of a conundrum. One of the ways in which the current government have done it is to establish an industrial strategy council, 16 members, and the intention is that this will be rooted in statute. It won't, as it were, fall when the minister leaves office. We will have a statutory role that continues. I think it also reflects, and that's the kind of the legal position. It'll be evident to you that the current government is not of the party that I was a member of in government. The fact that the Secretary of State and the Chancellor appointed one of their predecessors, I think, gives a bit of an insight into their intention that this should be above party politics, another way in which it can endure. And the fact that the 16 members are derived from academia, but also from business, I think kind of respected figures, are all designed to give it a degree of longevity that is not typical of politics. The independence that comes from that, I think, comes both from the remit and from the character of the individuals. And again, I think to have a set of policies that are government policies, but to develop them with and have their implementation monitored and evaluated by a set of independent people who are literally independent as the statute that enshrines it will be. These are the purposes. This is the way it's been done. And I have to say, as someone that tried to do it myself and found it didn't endure, I think they've made a much better start than I was able to.
Thank you. And we go for short reflections here in the beginning because we want to leave time for discussion, which will come at the very end after the two roundtables. Alessandro.
Yes, I will refer to the reason why the EU at a certain moment took the steps to start a process for the establishment of productivity boards across Europe. As usual, the starting point is the perception of a situation of crisis. It was the financial crisis, or better, the debt crisis of the euro. As you may remember, a number of EU countries at the start of their financial crisis situation, large current account imbalances. So it was perceived that it was important to coordinate across Europe the policies that could help adjusting competitiveness, namely relative prices, including the wage setting process. So the Commission, this was basically the content, you may remember, of the 5 Presidents' report, 2015. The Commission chose a relatively light legal instrument to foster this process, a recommendation, not a recommendation from the Commission, a recommendation from the Council, also to favor, let's say, the ownership of this process by the Member States. It was evident that the Member States did not have appetite for this type of boards whose main objective was that of favoring the adjustment of relative prices, not only because, let's say, entering into the wage setting process is very difficult for governments, but also because there was already a changing perception of what was the priority. It was not any longer that of preventing and corrective imbalances, it was that of favoring the recovery and a stronger growth down the road. Not only because of, okay, this is good for for living standards, but also for macro stability reasons. You have to remember that the initiative was an initiative motivated by macroeconomic reasons. So it was the Economic Policy Committee of the ECOFIN Council that discussed the draft regulation, the recommendation. So the idea was that of establishing a pro-productivity institutions. And this was also, in a sense, motivated by the fact that while there were no previous examples of competitiveness boards to adjust relative prices, there were examples, including Australian and other examples, of pro-productivity institutions. In this respect, it was useful, the analytical work already carried out by the OECD, to understand how this recommendation could have been drafted. The other thing that we realized is that overall the appetite by the member states to establish, to set up this type of institutions was not very strong. Frankly, at the beginning, there was a certain degree of, let's say, skepticism for mainly two reasons. The first reason was simply financial. Member states didn't want to spend money to set up these institutions. This was solved by making very explicit in the recommendation that the institution need not to be a new institution, but an existing institution could have been tasked for these objectives. The second reason is that there were those that were sort of skeptical about the usefulness of that. Mainly those that never had any institution carrying out a similar type of tasks. This was the interesting thing. But at the end, let's say, little by little, these institutions, they were set up in place and started operating.
Thank you. Juan Francisco, what's the motivation for getting a productivity board in Spain?
Oh, let me start by subscribing the words by Alessandro. I think that the main motivation from the European Commission at that time was that the gap in labor productivity and GDP per capita with the US was widening and growth in Europe was very low, so the basic reaction was, let's try to create institutions to promote productivity growth and so on. Spain was one of the countries with less appetite for this endeavor, and the productivity board in Spain was created at the end of last year. And the way that I translate what the Commission had in mind when they made this recommendation of the countries is in three goals. I think that the role of this and the way that I conceive the productivity boards to have an influence is by first communicating the importance of productivity growth, which in policy is not always well appreciated. Why productivity growth is important, why the distribution of productivity gains are important, how to promote inclusive growth. All these things in a country like Spain are not very much debated. So this is our first goal, trying to make sure that policymakers and the public opinion understand the gravity of the situation and how to take actions to solve it. The second goal is somehow to provide resources and to provide an environment so that research and analytical work on productivity growth can be more relevant. On this, we have the limitations that Alessandro already mentioned, which is resources are not that many. But there is something that we have achieved already, which is trying to improve on the data pro situation. We were able to convince the tax agency and the Social Security Administration to merge their register, which for many of you, this will be a very small achievement. But for a country like Spain, having a proper match employer-employee data set with information about firms and information about who works in those firms is a real progress. And this data set is available for external researchers, so this thing is a significant progress. And then the third mandate is to conduct our own analytical and research work on productivity. Again, limitation of resources is important here. We don't have the staff that other more established productivity commission or productivity boards have. But still, we are able, we want to do this in the future. No? So we will try to somehow get the resources to do this. Our institutional setup is somehow odd. I will talk about this in the second round. But still, I am very happy with the composition of the board, and I am confident that we could provide new insights on why productivity is low and how to improve productivity growth.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Italy, you've also recently established a board. Tell us about its rationale and setup.
Thank you, Jens. Thanks all of you for welcoming also Italy to this consensus. We started 1 year ago, so we have just celebrated our first birthday with the release of the report. And the rationale was essentially what Alessandro has mentioned, was this recommendation of the Commission. The appetite was, of course, very low. We tried several times in Italy to set up the board, but at the very last time, the government always, at the very last moment, the government was not, let's say, consequential. Till we started to point out, but we are the last within the euro area without the board. Yes, but also Spain doesn't have it, until Spain did it a few months before us last year. And so we were the very last, and at that moment we were somehow, let's say, convinced that we should do that. And we did that. We're very happy about it. We have created it within the Italian Economic and Social Committee, which is a constitutional body, consultative body within the Italian institutions, consultative body like the Brussels one to the parliament and the government, non-political in the sense that there are social parties represented as stakeholders, and within that body we have created an independent board made of, in a technical composition, academics and representatives of Bank of Italy and the National Statistical Institute. That somehow attenuates the resource constraint, because Bank of Italy and the National Statistical Institute have been very instrumental in helping us designing and putting together the first report. Another important thing is that we have decided, and I think ex post it as at least seeing how the first report has been received in the country, with, I would say, vast consensus. We have decided to concentrate on productivity strictly, not on competitiveness at large. So we haven't talked about necessarily, although we have touched upon, but not talked about wage adjustment mechanism and things like that, but we have talked about productivity within the territories, within the firm, in an international context, and broad policy recommendation to foster better productivity growth. We'll come back on those later. However, in order not to have a, let's say, dismal productivity board only made of technicians, only talking about productivity, we have created a sort of a double composition. There is a Danish interesting experiment into the boards where they have two layers. We have a technical composition where we have the academics, National Statistical Institute, Bank of Italy, and two representatives of the OECD that help us also in the policy analysis. But then we have sort of a more institutional composition of the board where we have to discuss about the broad directions and what is emerging from the analysis. In that broad composition, we have the chief economists of the Treasury and representatives of trade unions and the Employers Association. And within that composition, we can start already, let's say, form a bit of a consensus about the policy directions, the type of analysis that we are envisaging. And that, I think, has really helped the technical part of the committee to shape the direction of analysis while maintaining its own independence and, of course, evidence-based, strict scientific methodology.
That's super interesting, these kind of details about how do you actually build a productivity institution. I wonder, Alessandro, when you look at different European countries, what do you draw of lessons in terms of how to do handle these issues of institutional design in the best possible ways? And I guess the best possible ways there's not one version of that. There may be multiple.
Right. There are elements that are, let's say, defined ex ante, by design in a sense. And I still referring to the recommendation by the Council. The first element that is required ex ante is a mandate that, let's say, to have sense in a European context, needs to be sufficiently homogeneous. So the idea was to have institutions that can be different, also because there are big differences in the policy-making traditions and contexts. And this is why a light instrument was chosen, a recommendation, and not a regulation or a directive, but also with a minimum element of homogeneity. So the recommendation contains the mandate, which is basically analyzing productivity and developments in productivity and competitiveness, and having independent assessments of policy options, with also the requirement of producing one annual report. There are also requirements in terms of a minimum level of expected effectiveness of these institutions. And expected effectiveness was interpreted especially in terms of credibility. So to be credible, these institutions, they need to be autonomous from political interference, what Greg was referring about before. In this respect, the recommendations also, let's say, qualifies this further. So selection of the board on the basis of experience and competence rather than political considerations. Access to resources and capacity to communicate directly without interference. Second condition is credibility in terms of being unbiased, so not being perceived as making the interest of a particular group in the society. And so balanced representation of stakeholders. And the third requirement is credibility in terms of the quality of the analysis that is put forward. So capacity to carry out high quality analysis and research. there is nothing about resources. And with hindsight, maybe this is something that could have been dealt with, because at the end we have been realizing that the resources devoted to the productivity boards were relatively scarce. It is interesting to compare the average number of board members across Europe, which is something between 10 and 15, I don't remember the exact figure, and the average number of the staff, which is 2.5. So probably a minimum amount of resources, also by recommendation, could have been also a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Now,
sorry, I want to say the most important thing of all, that what is important for a good function of the boards, effectiveness, is not only what comes from design. It is the interplay between design, practice, and the feedbacks from, at the end, having a voice in the debate which is sufficiently authoritative that provides a feedback loops. So it's more complex.
Having voice and getting impact with your messages, I wonder, Carlo, you have recently published the first report from the Italian Productivity Board. What were the messages?
So, as you know, Italy is a country that has always been characterized by very low productivity growth. Take it as labor productivity, or TFP, according to international measures. And yet, over the last 4 or 5 years, right after the pandemic, the country has seen employment growth which is more than twice higher than the EU average, GDP growth which is in line with the EU average, and quite a success in exports, growth in export which is higher than France or Germany, for example. So what we have tried to sort of unbundle is this strange equilibrium in which the country is, where from a macroeconomic point of view, things seems to be okayish, and that is a risk because policymakers might believe that this is actually something that might continue over the long term. So why would you change a set of policies that, all in all, given all the turmoil in the world, is keeping the Italian society more or less in a sort of quiet position compared to other countries. On the other hand, however, we do see that productivity is, over the last couple of years, actually negative territory, that the qualification of the workforce is not progressing, and that the gap in ICT capital and technology of the country with the rest of Europe and the world is increasing. So we try to enter into this sort of bad equilibrium, bad from the point of view of the long-term perspective that the country is in. And basically what turns out is that because of the energy price shock, real wages in the country have dropped way below the level of 2021. That has been certified also by the OECD Employment Outlook recently. That was very instrumental also in helping our debate, to put it frankly, because it provided an objective analysis of where real wages were in the country. And because of real wages are so low and capital is more expensive, interest rates are higher than with respect to the previous 10, 15 years in Europe because of the anti-inflation dynamics. And the fact that the qualification of the workforce is not so high, and capital, especially ICT capital, requires as a complement skilled labor. We do know that. Basically, firms have started to hire low-skilled labor to substitute for complex, expensive capital, especially in traditional sector compared to ICT. ICT is growing, top-end manufacturing is growing, but by very little, while other industries are expanding much more. And at the end, this gives a composition effect which ends up in that bad equilibrium I was discussing. So we have uncovered that with analysis of data, both at the territorial level, at the single firm level, and in comparison with the other countries. And we have started to sort of promote policy proposals that would break this vicious circle that the country is sort of. And here there was, to put it frankly, a political choice. You can either start by acting on the wage, because wages are too low, so you can act on the wage and increase the wage so that companies are not forced to hire or incentivized to hire low-skilled workers. But that would have been politically toxic in the country. Or, second option, you can start by supporting training of the workforce with design of incentives, training of unemployed people, training within the job, on the job, reform of the schooling system, knowing that that training will lead to higher wages and therefore break the circle. So in the report, at the end of the first chapter, which has been translated in English, and if you go around, I've put a cover page with a QR code where you can download easily that version of the chapter. There is a quite detailed list of policy recommendations that go in that direction.
That sounds like a very interesting report, actually. Spain.
Hopefully.
Juan Francisco, from your productivity board, you've also been giving out recommendations recently?
Well, we are in the process of writing the first annual report. We have been slower than the Italians, not as in football, where we are quicker and more successful. But our first annual report...
Point taken and accepted.
Our annual report is going to provide a summary of the productivity situation in Spain, how the distribution of productivity gains are going, because there is this perception that workers are losing. Then a chapter on investment and the importance of investment for productivity growth, and finally regulation of product markets and services, and what are the impediments of regulation for increasing productivity growth in a country like Spain, where there are 4 layers of regulation, which constrain economic activity, the European level, the national level, then regional and local. There is a wide set of regulations, and first complain a lot about all of this. So we want to provide some insight on how regulation works and why is or is not important for productivity growth. So the test of the first goal that I mentioned before, communicating to politicians and policymakers, is going to be the presentation of our first report and how to communicate this annual report in a country where there are some specificities which are important for this type of communication. In Spain, we used to say that Spain is different in a negative tone, but in some ways we are different. First, it's a country very polarized politically. This means that anything that you might say might be in conflict with the political debate. And on this, the composition of the National Productivity Board helps us, because we have 7 academics, independent, with high international reputation. We have representatives from the ministries, and we have 4 representatives of social partners, employer association and trade unions. So if we are able to reach a consensus on these topics and communicate them, I think we will be listened. We will be credible in this communication. But on the other hand, we have some disadvantages. One is the polarization that I mentioned before. The other one is the complacency about the economic situation in Spain. Okay, Spain, in the last 3 years, have been growing. GDP growth is close to 3% in every year, which for European standard is extremely high. Productivity growth apparently has rebounded. Productivity per working hour, labor productivity per working hour is growing at 1%, during this period, these last 3 years, which is not much, but is twice of the growth before the COVID crisis. And there is the perception that the structural problems of the Spanish economy are not very well appreciated. In particular, in a situation where demographics is going to be very adverse for Spain. I was glad that Bart mentioned yesterday the importance of demographics for understanding how productivity growth is going to evolve in the future. So given the elimination of the demographic dividend and the fall in the working age population in Spain, we need productivity growth to increase to 2.5%, just to keep GDP per capita constant. So the situation is going to be very difficult in the next decades. And for that, I think that communicating the importance and making credible recommendations on how to improve productivity growth is going to be very, very, very relevant.
Thank you. Now, Greg, it would be a little bit unfair to ask you what would be the recommendations from ISAC, because you've just been established so recently, but maybe can you tell us a bit about what the areas might be priorities for action and evaluation?
I will, Jens, thanks. Although I should also caveat it, we've got a meeting next week of the Council to determine our work programme for the next year. So perhaps if I predict what we might agree on, but my colleagues may have different views. I think the first is monitoring and evaluation. There is a great appetite to, given this is an independent body, to make sure the government is doing what it said it would do, the policies contained in the strategy. And then as the months and years continue, there's also a part of that monitoring and evaluation to assess and report publicly on whether the actions, if they have been taken, have had the effect that were anticipated. So that'll be a big focus of the Council and its Secretariat. The second thing is that the intention and, again, the formal remit of the Council is to undertake some research projects of its own using its secretariat and resources. These are likely, I think, to be cross-cutting themes. So one might be skills, for example, and whether the skills requirements of the sectoral focus of the industrial strategy are being delivered and whether the policies are there for that. I think there's another one looking at across sectors at regulation and models of regulation, whether they are sufficiently, whether they're changing sufficiently to support a more perhaps disruptive need in many of the sectors. I think that is likely from previous discussions to be of interest to the ISAC, to the Industrial Strategy Council. And the third thing is, as is always the case with a plan, with a strategy, it's great to have one, and there's a great sigh of relief when one has been developed, but events intervene, and you can't have as it were, a fossilized plan. And so I think part of the work of the Industrial Strategy Council is to have some agility and flexibility to monitor what unexpected events might take place in the world during the year ahead, and make sure that there is a response to that, or at least advise that there should be a response to that by the government, and to monitor and to assess publicly as to whether that response is adequate.
Wonderful. Now, this actually concludes the first panel, the panel of the recently established commissions. We will shift, and I will invite the next panel up here, those that are representing commissions that have been around for a while. And I'll hand over the moderating role to Dan Andrews. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jens. That was a really interesting way to kick off the discussion. So as Jens mentioned, this second session focuses on those more well-established or longer-established productivity commissions, and in particular trying to sort of reflect on the practical lessons that they can share, which may help our colleagues from the first session. So in terms of the panel composition, I think everyone knows everyone on stage, but briefly we've got Catherine de Fontenay from the Australian Productivity Commission. Catherine also has a background in academia. I think Stanford at some point, was it? Or
I did my PhD there. I was at Melbourne University.
Yeah. Rodrigo, obviously, who we know, and who can forget Bart? So welcome up again. And obviously Bart's got the long history in terms of the conference board as well, and now you've got your own productivity institute, which is really interesting to see how that's progressing. In terms of like what I wanted to sort of talk about first was sort of in terms of like the opening round of questions, we'll kind of focus on particularly what's been the role of productivity commissions in respective countries, where have they added value, for instance, what could be a particular structural reform that be involved in, or have they stopped something bad from happening? But maybe, Catherine, you could kick off, maybe 3-4 minutes, and then Rodrigo, you could jump in.
Sure. So the Productivity Commission has been around since 1921. It was the tariff board at the time. It became the Productivity Commission in 1998. It's probably a rare instance of an institution that was originally anti-trade becoming pro-free trade. So gradually, in the 60s in particular, it became populated by economists who wanted industry to justify why they should receive assistance, why they should receive tariff protection. And so it became an important institution for monitoring trade and industry assistance. So that's important right now in terms of tracking what governments are doing in the way of industry assistance and assessing whether those policies are first just figuring out where the dollars are going, but also what their impact are. Then, over time, we became involved in sort of all of microeconomic reform, which, and were very involved in a big movement of economic reform in microeconomic reform in the 1990s. So it's a long history, and it does mean that there are periods where we have more influence and periods where we have less influence. So when governments have less appetite for reform, they might ask us to do studies into very narrow questions so that we don't come up with anything that is too challenging to do. And at other times where there's more urgency for reform, then the questions that we're asked are broader. In the last year, we have had a lot of prominence in Australia because the productivity slowdown has been a real focus of policy. And that was actually not our doing. That was I think, primarily the role of the Reserve Bank, our central bank. So Australia experienced a lot of inflation, as did a number of other countries. And a lot of wage inflation over the same period, partly for industrial relations reasons, partly because of the inflationary forces that were around. And the Reserve Bank were very clear that unless productivity was growing at a certain rate, if we were having wage inflation of 4% and productivity growth of 0%, then that was going to be inflationary and they could not cut interest rates. So this really focused the minds of the public on the question of productivity and the lack of productivity growth. And that in turn led the government, led the treasurer to commission us to undertake reports into 5 big areas of the economy on what needed to change structurally to improve productivity in the short to medium term. And it led to a major roundtable a few weeks ago convening major leaders of industry and labor representatives and key political figures and key academics to sort of talk about what reforms needed to be on the table. So it was very exciting to be part of that process.
Excellent. And I think another sort of, obviously the RBA was key. Another sort of important sort of juncture was when the Treasury downgraded the productivity assumption and its medium-term fiscal projections from 1.5 to 1.2. And I just saw on the FT app there's speculation that's going to happen in the UK potentially as well. Which
big debate at the moment.
Yeah, so maybe you can reflect on that later, Bud. But Rodrigo, what about from your perspective? You know, from the National Commission of Evaluation and Productivity, any insights on this same question?
Yeah, sure. First, we were set up as a baby Australian productivity commission. Actually, we copied everything a little bit in a smaller scale. But yeah, and the reason was we were set up in 2014, basically because we were seeing a slowdown in growth. But the concern was not really from the macro side, because there was a consensus that Chile had done basically everything right in the macro reforms. But not everything, but I mean many. You never do everything right. But many things were done right, and we were bumping into some problems in the micro area. So we were set up always as thought of as an institution that would study specific sectors or even more specific areas of any problem with public policies that the government needed, right? So we get specific requests. The first one was look at the copper mining sector, which is of course very important for the Chilean economy, and we did a full report, took us a year. We looked at everything, the regulation, the providers, programs by the large mining firms, the training, etc. We looked at everything. Then we did a report on female labor participation, and then we did the construction sector, and then we started getting into very specific issues like some studies in the health sector, looking specifically at how public hospitals were run, and then we got into this area of regulations, specifically permitting, prior to investing, and there we've had some successes actually. We're quite. I think. We were instrumental in a big reform that was actually approved a month ago that reformed the permitting system in Chile. We had done the groundwork at least in 2019, looking at and providing lots of evidence of how much time does a desalination plant take to get all their permits. It's a huge number of it's a lot of time. But that's an important point because we helped push this reform just by showing the evidence. We have the findings and the recommendations in the studies. They didn't take our recommendations. They went another way. But the evidence we provided was actually what really I think tipped the balance to that reform being approved to build the consensus across all political sectors. And I think that's at least the way we can make a difference and add value in the Chilean context, right? Where everyone kind of knows what's good, what should be done, and you need to add a little bit more of pressure, give it a little bit of a push that mobilizes the political system to work. Of course, you have to be very careful of not being perceived as partisan. That we've been very, very careful with that. We think of ourselves as we can add. We have a value proposition for any political sector if they come if they take the government. For instance, the center-right-ish government requested this regulation inquiries, but we've also done work that's been very valuable to the more leftish government we have now. So yeah, you have to be very careful of being and seeming independent. That's how I think we got. That would be too much, but we finally were able to push a little bit this center-leftish government to do a reform that is more perceived to be of the right, like has the flavor of deregulation and that stuff. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about other reforms later.
Super interesting. So Bart, at the Productivity Institute, you've been recently working on a comparative analysis of pro-productivity institutions, and I was wondering if you could kind of reflect on some of the the key elements of design of these productivity commissions or productivity boards, and what would be maybe 2 fundamental lessons you can take from that.
Yeah, let me start by preambling a little bit, because I feel a little bit like a mystery guest in these 2 panels, because I'm actually the only one who's not sitting on any of these productivity commissions. But when I arrived here in the UK to work on the Productivity Institute, one of our first ideas is the UK doesn't have a productivity commission. Shouldn't it have one? Actually, pro-productivity policies in the UK were very fragmented. However, we all know in the late 2010s, the UK had other things on their mind, including leaving the EU, and therefore not necessarily going onto the bandwagon of national productivity boards as the EU did. So we've kept arguing for this, and when the new government came in, the current Labour government, we actually put in a plea that a productivity commission was necessary, and then the industrial strategy came around, and we now have the Industrial Strategy Advisory Committee, which I agree takes care of a very large part of the productivity agenda, but not the entire one, because there's sort of big macro elements, for example, that are not covered. Housing and some other elements are not directly covered. So I think still the productivity policy landscape in the UK is still somewhat fragmented, but I definitely hope that ISAC will help us and make a difference here. But this sort of observations has led us to indeed think about, how do other countries actually do these productivity commissions and productivity boards? And we found large differences, and I think that come through very clearly also in this panel. But there's one thing that I think is really critically important. It really comes through so clearly when Alessandro was speaking about, the lack of enthusiasm in the EU for this topic. And that is the narrative around productivity, because it's not so obvious that productivity is something that will excite governments very quickly to start working on. Growth is important, we all know that, but productivity is this abstract topic. We in the room all know what this stuff is about, but the narrative that this is the long-term driver of growth and wealth and living standards and everything really needs to be developed, and the productivity commissions really need to carry that narrative. And I think that the visibility, therefore, is not only there for government, but also for the broader public. So I think that narrative is really, really critically important and something to think about. Now, to your question about what did we learn from studying these various productivity commissions, in fact, the OECD has done great work on this themselves, and those of you who have had a chance to look at the 10-year anniversary book, you'll see a really nice chapter at the back, which is building on some previous work at the OECD that looks at, design issues, institutional setup issues, responsibilities, and stakeholder engagement. I'll say something about each of those. On institutional setup, and it's come up a couple of times, is how independent should these committees be relative to government? So on the one hand, you want them to be independent for all the reasons many of you explained. This is a complex topic. Although productivity itself may be apolitical, the policies around it can be quite political, so you want to have some distance from government to form your own opinion with experts and academics. But on the other hand, you also want to be in a situation that government is not going to ignore you, so it has to be owned by the government. And I think finding the right institutional setting, of course it differs country by country, and there's probably not one recipe, but finding that balance between how independent can you be from government versus the ownership that government needs to have is important. I think one question I would have, therefore, is how good an idea it is to have a productivity commission sit in one government department, right? So yesterday we heard Fred Perry talk about the industrial strategy and said there were 21 departments of the 24 in the UK government that were involved in setting the industrial strategy. Now, for pro-productivity policy, it's pretty much the same. So if this sits in one department, do the other departments, even if it has a coordinating role, does it care? Or should it perhaps sit in the cabinet office? Should it be sitting in one of the major resource organizations linked to government? And again, this is not a criticism of any of the countries because institutional context is different. But I think it's very important to see how can you make sure that everyone across government and all these departments are going to take you serious. The other thing is on responsibilities. And this is a bit also, I think particularly also in the European case, a bit of a concern. There is this sort of requirement to do an annual report. Whereas, particularly when I hear our friends from Australia and Chile here, it's much more than an annual report. You respond to asks from government at any time. And we have to think in productivity policies about, there's so many policies that have productivity implications, and a productivity commission should provide the advice. What does this mean for productivity? If you undertake a policy change in transport, what does that mean for productivity, good or bad? What are the trade-offs? What are the complementarities? And how are we going to deal with that? You can't do that in an annual report. You need to sort of be available to actually do that, which then comes to the next issue, which was raised by our European friends, which is resources. Because if you're going to do that, you of course need to have people who are actually going to do the research for you and everything else like that. And maybe that's something we can come back to in the Q&A, but I do think that I think all the productivity boards need resources, and you in Australia are blessed with resources compared to many of the others. And I think even in Chile, I think you, if I may say so, you said this afternoon over lunch you had 17 people working for the Commission. I think some of our European friends will be jealous about that. You obviously need resources for this, and I think we need to think about that also in a European context. And then finally, I think the whole issue around stakeholder engagement, and it goes back to the issue of narrative. Transparency, I think, is really important here. So if the productivity commissions give advice, we would want government to respond. And partly not only to hold the government accountable, but also get the government to articulate why this is important, or why they're not picking up a particular policy because something else is important. That's true. I mean, it's political responsibility in the end. But I think in the engagement, it's very important that this is out in the open, that it is public, that government responds to these kind of things as well. So that's some of the things that we picked up. There's more, but just as an opening salvo, that's sort of the things that I was thinking.
Terrific, thanks, Bart. So we're sort of getting to sort of the final parts of this session, but maybe Rodrigo and Catherine, if there was sort of like one piece of advice you could give productivity commissions from the first session in terms of institutional design, or what you've kind of learnt from an organisational perspective, like what would it be? Like, and maybe, 1 minute each.
Look, it's really exciting that they have been established. Just really want to congratulate Alessandro and also obviously the boards of those productivity commissions for the excellent work. I think we receive a lot of visits from delegations of countries that are thinking about possibly setting up a productivity commission. And interestingly, they all have questions about how to ensure independence. So obviously that is a core challenge, and Bart articulated it very well. How do you remain relevant but remain independent? And so I do think that the EU is starting from a position of strength of having the requirement to have a productivity board maintained outside of the country, maintained at the EU level. That takes a little bit of the fragility out of the system. It doesn't remove the fragility of resourcing, but it does at least give them some longevity and some ability to think long-term about their mandate. I do think that Rodrigo's point about data is a really important one. We are most successful in shifting the conversation towards better policy and towards reform when we can put solid numbers out there that really shift the conversation. And it's important to staff your organization when you're allowed to have staff with very technical people, but technical people that are not only interested in doing extremely complex empirical work. While that has its place, I think graphs that are accessible to the general public, graphs that are accessible to politicians and other policymakers are really important. So we want the deep analysis, but we also want the clear explanation. And as you know from doing serious empirical work, Dan, if you may have done an amazing regression, but if it isn't also true in a graph, it's probably not true in the regression either.
Yeah. Rodrigo, what about you? Just a quick reflection, given time constraints.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with of course, with Catherine. It's I would put it as if it has to be in terms of an advice, I would say, well, invest in reputation, right? If the impact is going to come from the side more of the findings, and actually distilling everything into a catchphrase that people can repeat and write op-eds about it. And I mean, those have been our largest successes. You first have to really go the extra mile and invest in reputation, of credibility, of independence, maybe even pick a fight with the government, actually can establish and can assert your independence right from the start. I think that's very, very valuable since when you're just starting. We started with 17, with 13 people, actually, then we grew. And at that point, the thing was very fragile. People were really scared that, okay, the next government is going to shut this down. So how do we keep this thing going? And it was key, actually, that the president of the board was someone close to the current government, but my predecessor, the executive secretary, was actually someone very identified with the opposition, and they fought for it, actually. So the president of the board said to the minister, okay, we come together, we're not sold separately, okay? And that went a long way and paid for a lot of continuity when there was a transition of government. But another piece of advice, actually related, that I would say, is drive the conversation away from recommendations, even when it comes to your KPIs. Because one thing I'm asked all the time is, okay, you've given more than 500 recommendations. What's the percentage? How many of those have become policy? And that's a horrible question because, of course, we recommend things that haven't been done for a reason. There's some barrier there. There's an interest group. It's unpopular in the short term, etc. So if you're going to be measured by your success rate, first, well, it shifts your incentives, and you're going to propose trivial stuff. Yeah. So you want to be pushing hard policies that maybe will take time, and even if you succeed in making them a reality, it's going to happen maybe in 5 years or 10.
Terrific. So we're going to have to move on now. So final part of this session. What's next for the national productivity boards and commissions? Is there anything that you have in your mind that you haven't heard over the last 2 days that you would sort of like to point out?
Well, first, what I did here, because I do think the big transitions, whether it is technology or demographics or environmental or security, all weigh very heavily on productivity, to the positive but also to the negative end. So I think the productivity commissions need to address these kind of issues. But I think what we're also seeing is that, we have this productivity typology, and you've got these direct drivers that productivity commissions are directly responsible for. So the accumulation of the production factors, whether it's physical or human capital or intangible capital, and technological change or structural change. But I think these indirect drivers, competition policy that we talked a lot about, but also internationalization and trade, are playing a big role as well. But you really raised this interesting point about the macro prediction. So let me close on that one, because not just in the UK and also in other countries. In the UK, this is a big debate. With demographic change to be very slow, productivity is about the only driver of economic growth going forward. So it makes a heck of a lot of difference what our forecasters are telling us it will be. So for example, in the UK, the budget for office responsibility is now being held accountable for the fact that, you've been pretty optimistic in previous forecasts on the productivity growth rate. It's not realistic. But if they tune it down, it has massive implications for the amount of fiscal room that the government has, the kind of things that we can do. And I think that's why it's so important here to keep that sort of long-term focus on this kind of things. Because, short, quick wins cannot be had in the case of productivity, and you quite often make a lot of mistakes if that is happening. So there's low-hanging fruit, pick it, and that's what the Productivity Commission should be doing. But also, where is this long-term element, and what are the implications of all these things, these big transitions that we're talking about for these long-term productivity forecasts? I think Productivity Commissions and boards have to play a very important role in that.
Terrific, thanks Bart. So that closes the second session here. So now what we're going to do is sort of do a Q&A. Obviously we've got space constraints on the stage. There's one more seat if someone wants to come up here, and I'll ask the other speakers when they're called upon to come up to the lectern here. In terms of just a bit of housekeeping, for those people online, we've got the question things through Slido. In terms of what we can do if the audience here is sort of collect a few. If you want to ask a question, put your hand up. Let's sort of collect a few. But what I might first do is just to kick things off. Juan Francisco, did you just want to sort of come up and just reflect? Did you want to add anything to what Bart said in terms of what's next at all, or up to you? So, and you're happy to just, you can just face the audience from there if you prefer that as well.
You want me to react to the macro?
Yeah, just in terms of like what's next and for productivity boards and commissions, anything you just want to add, maybe a couple of minutes just to reflect on that?
So what's next? I think two things that have been mentioned are very important. One is the issue of resources. This is key. Otherwise, these national productivity boards could be influential, trying to communicate results from, research institutions, from academia, and so on. But the political economy of these policies is very, very complicated. Through this conference, we talk a lot about, political economy and about the difficulties of communicating results. This reminded me the words of Yogi Berra, an American popular philosopher who was very successful as a baseball player and a baseball coach. He said, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. And we are about practice. We have to convince politicians and policymakers to make policies guided by the evidence, but being concerned about the political process, which, as I said, in Spain is a nightmare these days with the polarization. So just let me say the two things that I will ask Alessandro to put in a directive, if you want to push a directive to help these national productivity boards. One is a requirement on resources. I think that independence is very well established, and I don't care much about this problem in my case. And the second one, it has also been mentioned, is the complain or explain rule. I think these two things are key for the future success of the national productivity boards.
That's terrific, thank you. Just one more sort of I'll use my prerogative as chair here. So, Katrine, you mentioned the Economic Reform Roundtable in Australia, which took place in the mid to late August. And around the same time, the PC sort of released a series of interim 5 pillars inquiries. Do you want to sort of just reflect on that process? I think it's probably unlikely that a lot of people in the room are actually aware of what happened there, and just sort of maybe take 3 minutes just to sort of talk us through that, the PC's role, or just any kind of interesting things there.
Yeah, sure. So the treasurer in December asked us to undertake these five reports and the final reports will come out at the end of this year. One was on the business environment and sort of business dynamism more broadly. One on skills and adaptable workforce. One on the care economy. One on data and digital policies, and one on sort of getting to net zero efficiently. So kind of covering all the bases, not exactly small. And in doing so, he was kind of committing to doing something about productivity. And so, and he asked us to come up with a few actionable ideas in each of these areas that could be implemented in the short term and would make a difference in the short to medium term. So whereas some of our focus in productivity is the long term, these were sort of more immediately implementable, and I think that reflected the urgency of the productivity doldrums that we're in. And then the Prime Minister announced that he was going to hold a 3-day productivity roundtable shortly after the release of our reports, and that there would be this giant negotiation over what actions the country should take to improve productivity. And so that sort of turbocharged the productivity conversation in a way that I really have never experienced before. Everybody, random people on the street, wanted to talk to you about productivity, and it was very unusual. And so it was very stressful producing these interim reports just before the roundtable. And as Rodrigo said, it's difficult to measure the impact in terms of how many of our recommendations look like they're likely to be adopted. In some areas, so we recommended some changes to the corporate tax rate, for example, to attract more capital to Australia. Those have been very unpopular. We recommended some changes to the process to deregulate. Those have been more popular. We recommended that Australia hold off on adopting an EU-style regulatory approach to artificial intelligence and perhaps just take stock of where there are gaps in our existing regulation. And that looks like that will probably be the approach that Australia takes. I think that that's pretty important in terms of Australia getting the benefits of the artificial intelligence revolution. And so, you know, I won't drag you through all the recommendations, but they did feed into the roundtable. Aside from deregulation and recommendations we've made about improving efficiency of approvals in things like new transmission lines for net zero, I don't know that all of them were sort of agreed on at the roundtable, but they formed the basis of discussion. So we put out these corporate tax recommendations. Everyone said, we hate your recommendations. And then the response was, well, okay, well, so what do you suggest? And it led to a really fascinating discussion about, well, what should we do about our tax regime, which taxes income tax far too heavily and does not tax other areas in an efficient way?
Yeah, I think like the last time Australia seriously had a crack at corporate tax reform was, say, 2013 or so, and it just put it back on the table, right? Like all of a sudden, it was actually, people were able to talk about the tax system, and so I thought it was really effective. The other reflection, besides seeing Katrina on TV a lot when I was in Australia, was the front page of the Australian Financial Review had this headline around the dynamism chapter about how there's 32 steps to be able to serve a flat white, which is like an Australian cappuccino in Brisbane. And it listed all the kind of regulatory frictions and so forth. And so there's some really accessible insights in that. So
I think a 3-day round table with the Prime Minister on productivity is a unique thing, right? I don't think anywhere in the world that has ever happened.
It was really exciting. And I also think people understood that in our modern and complex economies, productivity is, as our chair says, a game of inches. It's not that one thing that is going to fix all our productivity problems. We have to be solving and reforming in a number of different areas. And it felt like the country as a whole got on board with that idea.
Okay, so was there any, thanks Katrin, was there any questions in the room before I, okay, so we'll go with our host first, I think. And then Giuseppe as well. So maybe you can ask them sort of sequentially, and then the panel can have a go at them.
I'm using a hand mic instead of my personal mic. It's not, been downgraded now. No, I just wanted to ask a little bit, because I think the examples that you tended to give were very much deep diving into a particular policy area. But have you maybe given advice back to the government ever on things like their broader institutional arrangements around the way they do growth, or maybe the way that the civil service works, or maybe even ministers work, to kind of advise them on the kind of how of growth rather than the what necessarily?
Me or Rodrigo?
Anyone, looking at all of you.
Maybe Rodrigo has a go.
Yeah, well, of course, that's very country specific. So no specific recommendation, I think, can be made directly. But I would say in general that you should aim to have a system that's different from other institutions. You don't want to be confused or mistaken by with other institutions or other commissions that have been formed and then closed down. You want to have an aura of, okay, now this is different. Now this is special. So however you do, for instance, appoint in general, well, of course you already have a board in the UK, but in other countries, however you appoint board members of other councils, etc., do it differently, do it with a little bit of an extra layer of, I don't know, ceremony or independence or something like that. I think that worked for us. Make a point of making it, for instance, also interdisciplinary. That was a big basis for success for our first board, where we had people from all walks of life, not only economists or people involved exclusively in public policy. That would be the most general thing I could say about appointments, at least.
Perfect. Okay. Actually, I'll go to a question online. It's for Greg. So regional disparities in productivity are an important issue for the UK. How will you address this in your work of ISAC, and how will you share the knowledge of local and regional authorities?
Thank you. Well, it's a good question. So one of the organising principles of the industrial strategy is to recognise place, essentially capturing the idea that growth doesn't happen in the abstract. You can optimise the national conditions, but actually, if particular places aren't participating in those discussions, then they can be awry and they can undo some of the work that's done at the national level. Across the 8 industrial strategy sectors, there's a mapping looking at regions of the country where there are particular clusters of activity, and through a kind of parallel but related program of devolution. Many people here will know that the UK has historically been a very centralised country. There is an ongoing program of devolution to regional mayors, regions being areas like Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, East Midlands and such like. Some of the tools that are proposed for industrial strategy, whether they are investment in infrastructure and R&D, will have regional involvement as well. And I would say the political context is that there is a lot of interest in each of the regions. I work for a university in the West Midlands at the impact of the national industrial strategy, not just at the national level, but its impact and engagement with particular regions as well. Okay,
Giuseppe, do you want to sort of get up now and sort of give us your...
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm Giuseppe Nicoletti, and I'm asking these questions because I sit currently in 2 boards, the French and the Italian one. So I am particularly interested in this, in the process, especially of how these productivity commissions or national productivity boards have an influence on policy. So I have basically 3 very short questions. One is I heard from both the Australian and the Chilean commissions that they respond to requests by governments. Okay, so my question is, to what extent this impinges on independence, in a sense that especially if you have few resources, having to respond to requests from governments, it could go both ways. In your description, it's a very virtuous way, because you are answering to questions that are relevant for productivity, but it could also be a way to disband a little bit, to kind of deviate the work of the Productivity Commission from its established work program. So that's the first question. The second question is, could you describe a little bit better how you hook up to the legislative process? Because in the end, I mean, you want to influence, the laws that are in the making. And for instance, in Italy, we have this, several occasions in which we can do that. We have a national competition law, which is at fixed times of the year. We have the budget law. We have at the European level, the national recovery and resilience plans, and so on. So I was interested in understanding, to what extent the agenda of the commissions was hooked up to these processes. Also, Alessandro, maybe you can tell us to what extent the European bodies have been involved in the national decisions.
Giuseppe, we might just sort of leave it there. So why don't I break this up into themes? So there's an issue there around obviously implementation, and Carlo, I think there's a question from the audience, from the online group, around implementation in your experience. So maybe you want to kick off the discussion on that. And I think there's clearly a question there for the Commission as well, Alessandro, around their role and so forth. So maybe we'll do it that way, and then if we've got some time, others can come in.
Thanks. No, we work very nicely together with Giuseppe, and we are actually capitalizing on his experience as a member of the French board as well, so thank you. No, on implementation, I think this is a very delicate issue because it hinges on the independence versus, let's say, reputation of the board. What we have done insofar, as I was saying, we have deliberately decided to propose a set of policy recommendations that have a broad, let's say, audience and a broad range of interests for different stakeholders, be it competition, the competition law, be it the training of the workforce, be it addressing regional disparities, which is another very important issue. So on our hand, the commitment is to follow up next year with, I think, a list of auditions with stakeholders, both at the technical level and at the policy level, that can help us better shape a subset of the policy proposal that we have put forward, and ensure that we can monitor their implementation and pushing through let's say, the legislation in the different occasions that Giuseppe was pointing out. At the same time, if you allow me, Dan, there's another very important issue which is related to the governance, at least in complicated countries like mine, where we have different layers of decision-making bodies, both at vertical and horizontal, in the sense that what we have realized is that there are many policies when we have scrutinized policies before coming up, what is existing before coming up with recommendation, no? So we have realized that across different ministries, there are different policies that maybe are not coordinated across them, but touch upon cross, let's say, contaminating areas in terms of incentives and things like that. So there has to be a role, I think we might propose, not advocate for ourselves, but propose a role of coordination of those policies across different ministries. And there is a role of, say, sort of coordination across different layers of decision-making bodies. Sometimes at the regional level, some decision. I'm glad that you're going with devolution, but watch out, because then it becomes a very complicated. And so what we have done, at least our experience, is that we have created this body of coordination between regions and the government, to which also as a board we should be talking, which ensures some level of coordination. Otherwise that becomes, in implementation terms, very complicated. Thank you.
Terrific. Alessandro, what about maybe if you want to reflect on the Commission's role in all this for a few minutes, just to give any additional insights on top of the first panel?
Yeah. I've been provoked directly by Juan on for coming directly with a specific. It's not so easy. It's not so easy because the role of the EU, and in particular the Commission, with the productivity boards in Europe is quite limited. At the beginning, in the recommendation, the original text was referring to a coordination role by the Commission. There was even the idea of, in a sense, making a summary of the reports by the boards across Europe, having a synthesis, having regular discussions, and so the Commission was, in a sense, providing the element of synthesis and to have a sort of a joint common output from the network. this was kept out deliberately by the Council. So the Council at the end wanted this language. The Commission could facilitate the exchange among the boards. So the language is quite different. No? So at the end, what we do is what is prescribed in the last paragraph of the recommendation, namely to monitor the recommendation, whether it is followed up, and whether it is necessary to come up with a new legal instrument. This has been done. There was a progress report in 2018, and it was realized that a majority of member states, either they had already a board in place or were planning to do that, and that the majority of the boards that were in place were broadly complying also with the recommendations concerning their statute. There was a second progress report that was confirming the trend towards, let's say, the establishment of more productivity boards. But there was also the, let's say, other documents where we were noticing that first one thing is to have the compliance with the minimum requirements of the recommendation. Another thing is really to make an impact on the debate at national level. And so there are differences between what happens, let's say, from the viewpoint of the statutory elements and what happens in practice. And that many of the important also, let's say, elements for the effectiveness of the productivity boards probably were not in place. Whether to come up with a new instrument, there are internal discussions. As you know now, the priority for the Commission is simplification. So simplification of EU regulations, EU legislation, and so on and so forth. So the moment is not the best one, but we have been thinking, including exactly the suggestions that you had. I liked very much the points made by Bart. I don't have illusions. Even with the directive, the risk is always that of complying with the minimum requirements, which does not mean having something that at the end works. No, this idea of having every board producing one report per year, the risks of let's say, identifying the objective as we need to give sufficient resources to make one report. This is the big risk. Sometimes what is in principle a minimum requirements is considered to be at the end what is the objective of the institution. Now, this is a big risk. The second consideration of Bart that I liked is the importance of the boards to make clear what are the constraints going forward to growth. It's productivity, but it's also growth. And this links to the other type of independent institutions that have been promoted across Europe, that are the fiscal independent institutions. And generally, if there is a dialogue between these institutions, like the Dutch case is very evident, because the CPB is at the same time the independent fiscal institutions and the productivity board. So you have these things that leverage together and contribute to evidence-based policy making.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alessandro. We're actually right at the close now, but I thought what we could do is give Bart maybe just a couple of minutes to sort of offer some final reflections. I'll let you go to 33 past. How does that sound?
What is it now?
31 past.
Oh my God. Okay, I better rush. Okay. I think it's 3 dimensions that come up. First is the breadth, the scope of the activity of the productivity commissions. And I think it's very broad and the scope is very wide. And that's also why government will find you irritating, because you are covering on a lot of fields that are responsibilities for individual departments. And that's why this independence is so important. That's why you have to be a little bit irritating or challenging to government departments. And government obviously has to be receptive for that as well. So I think the breadth of the issues is really coming through very clearly. The second one that's coming through, second dimension, is time. We all know that productivity is not going to happen overnight. We all know it's going to be a long-term trajectory and we need to get governments focused on it and committed on it. But we need some short-term wins in order to get the political support. And we all understand that, and we really need to think through what that looks like in the breadth and the scope of the agenda. Because some short-term wins are great in terms of long-term commitment. Some short-term wins can backfire and actually put you in a worse position than where you are. And it's a responsibility for the commissions to understand how these various time dimensions are. The last one is place. And Carlo, you made some really interesting, challenging comments on the UK place-based focus. I cannot see how you can do productivity without thinking about place. And there, I don't only think about regions that are behind, but also think about agglomerations that have all their challenges with housing and infrastructure and all those kind of things. I'm also thinking about public sector, because we all like to think about the big, shiny, high productivity sectors. But we need this everyday economy, and they need to become more productive too, including healthcare and social care and so on and so forth. And I think thinking from that place-based perspective, I think is another really important fact. So I think breadth, time, and place are really 3 important guiding principles that I've heard throughout this discussion.
Thanks, Bart.
That's 2 minutes, right?
No, you did really well. It feels like there's more questions, and I encourage you afterwards if there's time to sort of engage. I know some people have got trains to get, so we're going to have to finish off now. Thank you to all the speakers on the panel. Also, thank you for the UK government and also the OECD team for putting what is a fantastic conference on, and safe travels home. Thanks.